Hello, and welcome. In this video, we will be conducting a case analysis of a Supreme Court decision from the Philippines. The case is Davao ACF Bus Lines, Inc. versus Rogelio Ang, with the case number GR number 218,516, decided on March 27, 2019. By the end of this analysis, you will be able to identify the key facts of a legal dispute, determine the central legal issue, and understand the Supreme Court's reasoning and the legal principles it applied. Our objectives are to identify the facts, state the issue, and explain the Supreme Court's ruling and the legal principles used to reach that decision. Let's begin by understanding the background of this case. First, let's lay out the facts and background of this case. This will help us understand the context of the legal dispute. The case originates from a criminal case, People of the Philippines versus Rodolfo Borja Tanio. Tanio, who was the driver of a bus owned by Davao ACF Bus Lines, Inc., or ACF, was charged with reckless imprudence resulting in serious physical injuries. This charge stemmed from an incident where Tanio's bus collided with a Mitsubishi sedan, causing damage to the vehicle and serious injuries to its passenger, Rogelio Ang, who is the respondent in our current case. In December 2005, the Municipal Trial Court in Cities, or MTCC, convicted Tanio. The court also awarded civil damages to Rogelio Ang, totaling 900,000 Philippine pesos, which included nominal, moral, and exemplary damages, as well as attorney's fees. Crucially, Tanio did not appeal this judgment, so it became final and executory. The prosecution then filed a motion to execute the judgment against Tanio. However, the writ of execution was returned unsatisfied, meaning Tanio had no properties that could be seized to pay the damages. Because Tanio was insolvent, the MTCC, upon motion, issued a writ of execution against his employer, Davao ACF Bus Lines, Inc., based on the principle of subsidiary liability. The CF responded by filing a motion to recall or quash this writ of execution, arguing it was improper. The MTCC denied ACF's motion in an order dated March 21, 2007. However, the court did not immediately enforce the writ. Instead, it ordered that its implementation be held in abeyance. The MTCC's order stated that a hearing must first be conducted to determine if all the requisites for subsidiary liability under Article 103 of the Revised Penal Code were present. This means the court wanted to ensure ACF was legally responsible before enforcing the writ. The CF's motion for reconsideration was also denied by the MTCC. Feeling aggrieved, ACF filed a petition for review on certiorari with the Regional Trial Court, or RTC, seeking to nullify the MTCC's orders. The RTC denied ACF's petition, affirming the MTCC's decision to proceed with the hearing on subsidiary liability. ACF then appealed this decision to the Court of Appeals, or CA. The CA also denied ACF's appeal, affirming the RTC's decision. CF's motion for reconsideration with the CA was likewise denied. This led ACF to file the final appeal with the Supreme Court, which is the case we are analyzing today. Now that we have the facts, let's identify the central legal issue that the Supreme Court needed to resolve. The core question is whether the Court of Appeals was correct in affirming the RTC's decision. This decision stated that the MTCC did not commit grave abuse of discretion when it denied ACF's motion to quash the writ of execution and ordered a hearing to determine subsidiary liability. In simpler terms, the Supreme Court had to decide if the MTCC acted properly in its handling of the writ of execution against ACF. ACF's main argument was that the MTCC's final judgment against Tanio was supposedly null and void, and therefore any execution based on it, especially against ACF, was also void. The Supreme Court had to evaluate this claim. Before we look at the Supreme Court's ruling, let's review the key legal principles that are relevant to this case. These principles form the foundation of the court's decision. First is the principle of subsidiary liability. Under Article 103 of the Revised Penal Code, an employer can be held civilly liable for the crimes committed by their employees in the discharge of their duties, but only if the employee is insolvent and the employer is engaged in some kind of industry. This means the employer's liability is secondary. The victim must first try to collect from the employee. If that fails, then and only then can the victim pursue the employer, provided certain conditions are met. Second is the doctrine of immutability of judgment. This is a fundamental rule in law. It states that once a judgment becomes final and executory, it cannot be modified or altered in any respect, even if the modification is meant to correct an error. The purpose of this doctrine is to ensure stability and finality in the administration of justice. There must be a point where a case is considered closed. Third, we have the distinction between an error of judgment and an error of jurisdiction. An error of judgment is a mistake of law or fact made by a court in the exercise of its jurisdiction. An error of jurisdiction, on the other hand, occurs when a court acts without or in excess of its jurisdiction. This distinction is crucial because the remedy for each is different. An error of judgment is corrected through an appeal. An error of jurisdiction, however, can be challenged through a special civil action of certiorari, which is what ACF filed with the RTC. Finally, there's the principle that jurisdiction is determined by the allegations in the complaint, not by the amount ultimately awarded. This means a court's power to hear a case is established at the very beginning, based on what the plaintiff claims, not on the final outcome. With these principles in mind, let's examine the Supreme Court's ruling. The Supreme Court denied ACF's petition and affirmed the decisions of the Court of Appeals and the Regional Trial Court. The court's reasoning was based on several key points. First, the court found that ACF's basic factual premise was mistaken. ACF claimed the MTCC had already ordered the execution of the judgment against it. However, the court pointed out that the MTCC's order explicitly stated that the implementation of the writ was held in abeyance pending a hearing. This means the MTCC had not yet held ACF subsidiarily liable. It was merely setting the stage for a hearing to determine if the conditions for subsidiary liability were met. Since the act ACF complained of the actual execution had not even occurred, the petition was premature. Second, the court reiterated the distinction between errors of judgment and errors of jurisdiction. It emphasized that certiorari is a remedy for errors of jurisdiction, not errors of judgment. ACF's primary argument was that the MTCC's award of damages against Tanio was erroneous. The Supreme Court ruled that even if this were true, it would be an error of judgment, not an error of jurisdiction. Therefore, it could not be corrected through a petition for certiorari. Third, the court invoked the doctrine of immutability of judgment. The MTCC's judgment convicting Tanio and awarding damages was final and executory because it was not appealed. ACF's attempt to question the damage award was a collateral attack on this final judgment, which is not allowed. The court clarified that a mere erroneous judgment is not a void judgment, and therefore it is still immutable. Finally, the court addressed ACF's new argument, raised for the first time on appeal, that the MTCC lacked jurisdiction because the total damages awarded exceeded its jurisdictional limit. The Supreme Court rejected this argument for two reasons. First, it was raised too late. Second, and more importantly, the court reaffirmed the principle that jurisdiction is determined by the allegations in the complaint, not by the amount ultimately awarded. The MTCC had jurisdiction over the criminal case from the start. Let's summarize the ratio decidendi, or the reason for the decision, and the legal principles applied in this case. The Supreme Court's decision to deny ACF's petition was based on the following ratio decidendi. The MTCC did not commit grave abuse of discretion because it did not actually order the execution of the judgment against ACF. Instead, it ordered a hearing to determine if the requisites for subsidiary liability were present. The court's reasoning was further supported by several key legal principles. First, the principle of subsidiary liability under Article 103 of the Revised Penal Code, which requires a hearing to establish the employer's liability. Second, the distinction between errors of judgment and errors of jurisdiction, which limited the scope of the certiorari petition. Third, the doctrine of immutability of judgment, which prevented ACF from attacking the final judgment against its employee. And fourth, the rule that jurisdiction is determined by the allegations in the complaint, not by the final award, which validated the MTCC's original jurisdiction. In conclusion, the Supreme Court found no grave abuse of discretion on the part of the MTCC and affirmed the lower court's decisions, allowing the hearing on ACF's subsidiary liability to proceed. Let's quickly recap what we've learned today. We analyzed the case of Davao ACF Bus Lines, Inc. versus Rogelio Ang. We identified the facts. which involved a bus driver's conviction for reckless imprudence and the subsequent attempt to execute the civil damages against his employer. The central issue was whether the MTCC committed grave abuse of discretion in its handling of the writ of execution. The Supreme Court ruled that it did not, based on the ratio decidendi that the MTCC had not yet ordered execution, but only a hearing. This ruling was supported by key legal principles: subsidiary liability, the distinction between errors of judgment and jurisdiction, the immutability of judgment, and the rule that jurisdiction is determined by allegations. You are now able to identify the facts, state the issue, and explain the Supreme Court's ruling and the legal principles applied in this case. Thank you for watching.